You are in Rome. In the late 15th century, the air is heavy with incense and politics. The stones beneath your feet have seen centuries of empire and ruin. But in this particular decade, power no longer rests with emperors or generals. It sits in the crimson robes of the papacy, behind closed doors, in whispered deals and unsigned letters. Here, among the sprawling palaces and narrow alleyways, lives a young woman who will be remembered for everything and understood for nothing. Lucrezia Borgia. But before she was a symbol of scandal, before the name Borgia became synonymous with poison and plots, she was simply a daughter in a powerful, restless family, the making of a dynasty. Lucrezia Borgia was born on the 18th of April, 1480, in Subiaco, near Rome. Her father was Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal with ambitions larger than his faith, and her mother, Vanozza de Catanei, was one of his longtime mistresses. The Borgias were not Italian by birth. They were Valencian, hailing from Spain. And though Rodrigo had risen within the Roman Church, he was never fully accepted by the old Italian families. That foreignness, the sense of being outsiders in the heart of power, shaped everything the Borgias did. In 1492, after decades of manipulation and patience, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia ascended to the papal throne as Pope Alexander VI. His election was marked by open bribery, a common enough practice, though his brazenness shocked even the jaded cardinals. Gold changed hands in abundance, and powerful alliances were forged through promises of land and influence. When he emerged as pope, the church was less a spiritual institution and more a political engine, churning out favors, marriages, and military campaigns. And at the heart of this web sat his family, Cesare, his ruthless son, destined first for the church and then for command; Juan, the favored child, to whom the Pope entrusted his military ventures; and Lucrezia, the daughter who would become the soft face of the Borgia power machine. A daughter in a world of power, Lucrezia grew up surrounded by clerics, courtiers, and ambitious men. Her education was meticulous and expensive. She studied Latin, Greek, music, and poetry. Her tutors included some of the most respected scholars of the day, a reflection of her father's belief that an intelligent daughter could be as useful as an army. Descriptions of her vary, colored by bias and rumor. Some called her golden-haired and angelic, with eyes like polished amber. Others insisted that her beauty was exaggerated by propaganda, and that her true power was in her intelligence and calm composure. At a time when women were expected to be silent ornaments, Lucrezia was trained to speak with precision and diplomacy. She knew how to listen, to flatter, to charm. These were tools of survival, but they would also become her weapons. Marriage as politics. In Renaissance Italy, marriage was not a matter of affection. It was a transaction, a negotiation of bloodlines and dowries. In 1493, Lucrezia, barely 13, was engaged to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a member of one of the most influential dynasties in northern Italy. The Sforzas controlled Milan, and by linking his daughter to them, Pope Alexander sought legitimacy among Italy's elite. The wedding was a spectacle, an eruption of wealth and excess in the papal court. Banquets stretched for days. Gold-threaded gowns shimmered under torchlight. Musicians played endlessly in the papal palace, their notes echoing off marble walls decorated with frescoes that glorified both saints and sinners. But beneath the celebration, there was calculation. The marriage tied the Borgias to the Sforzas temporarily. For Rodrigo, alliances were never meant to last longer than they were useful. By the time Lucrezia was 16, the tides of Italian politics had shifted. The French invasion of 1494 changed everything. France's King Charles VIII swept through the Italian states, upending alliances, dethroning dukes, and threatening Rome itself. The Borgia Pope, ever the survivor, quickly adjusted his loyalties. The Sforzas, once valuable, were suddenly liabilities. Lucrezia's marriage, like a diplomatic treaty, was annulled in 1497. Officially, the church declared that the union had never been consummated. Unofficially, rumors swirled, claims of impotence, betrayal, even incest. Giovanni Sforza, humiliated, lashed out. He accused the Pope of desiring his own daughter. The accusation, scandalous and absurd, spread like wildfire. It would cling to Lucrezia's name for centuries. The shadow of scandal. In the flickering candlelight of the papal apartments, Lucrezia's future was being rearranged. While the world gossiped, she was sent to a convent in the countryside for reflection. Whether it was a punishment, a protection, or a pause in her usefulness, no one could be certain. During those months, whispers multiplied. A mysterious pregnancy was rumored, though no credible evidence survived. Some said the father was a servant. Others whispered Cesare's name. The truth, if there was one, was buried beneath layers of intrigue. The Borgias never confirmed nor denied anything. They simply moved forward. By 1498, Pope Alexander had secured a new alliance through France. Lucrezia was once again a bargaining chip, and she would soon marry Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, a union meant to strengthen ties with Naples, the calm before the poison. The marriage to Alfonso was different. Contemporary accounts suggest that Lucrezia may have genuinely cared for him. Alfonso, though politically useful, was also young, handsome, and courteous traits rarely found in Renaissance politics. For a brief moment, the Borgia household seemed peaceful. Lucrezia gave birth to a son, Rodrigo, in 1499. The Pope was overjoyed. Cesare, less so. For Cesare Borgia, who by then had become one of the most feared military commanders in Italy, alliances were obstacles unless they served his immediate goals. His ambitions to unify central Italy clashed directly with Naples, and therefore with Alfonso's family. And so, the shadows began to stir again, a household of murmurs. The papal palace in the late 1492 was not a home. It was a theatre of politics. Every servant, every meal, every corridor held the potential for intrigue. Lucrezia, now in her early 20s, was expected to balance domestic grace with political awareness. She hosted salons where poets and diplomats mingled. Her rooms became centers of quiet negotiation. Yet, the rumors never left her. To outsiders, the Borgia family was a symbol of corruption, a pope with too many mistresses, sons who killed without remorse, and a daughter who smiled amid it all. Inside the family, however, Lucrezia's position was both fragile and essential. She was the negotiator, the face that softened the Pope's cruelty and Cesare's Ennis, violence. Letters between father and daughter reveal a relationship built on genuine affection. Alexander called her our beloved daughter, the delight of our heart. But affection did not protect her from politics. The echo of death. In 1500, the fragile balance collapsed. Alfonso of Aragon was attacked one night on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived the first attempt, though gravely wounded. Lucrezia nursed him herself, refusing to leave his bedside. But one evening, as she left his room to pray, armed men entered and strangled him. The killers were never officially identified. Few doubted that Cesare had ordered it. Alfonso's death eliminated an inconvenient alliance and cleared the board for Cesare's next campaign. Lucrezia's grief was real, but it was also watched. Even her tears were political. Within weeks, she was summoned back into her father's orbit, now widowed and valuable once again. A daughter of the Vatican. After Alfonso's death, Pope Alexander appointed Lucrezia as the governor of Spoleto, a papal territory in central Italy. It was an extraordinary appointment for a woman of her time. An administrative role, requiring authority, intelligence, and restraint. She governed quietly, effectively, and with surprising independence. Reports from the period describe her as fair, cautious, and deeply engaged in local affairs. She mediated disputes, oversaw budgets, and maintained order in a region long troubled by banditry and corruption. For the first time, Lucrezia was more than a pawn. She was a ruler in her own right, albeit still under her father's watchful eye. But the family's power was reaching its peak, and with it came the slow decay that always follows unchecked ambition, the taste of power. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI continued to expand the Borgia legacy. Cesare's conquests grew bolder. The Vatican's coffers overflowed with gold, but enemies multiplied as well. The Borgias had made too many promises, betrayed too many allies. Italy was shifting once more, and the whispers of revolt grew louder. Amid this turbulence, Lucrezia was betrothed again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The match would finally give her a respectable position among Europe's nobility, far from the intrigues of Rome. But the journey from scandal to respectability would not be smooth. Even as she prepared to leave Rome, the city hummed with stories of poison rings, hidden lovers, and secret banquets where enemies vanished overnight. Most of those stories were exaggerated, some entirely false, but truth mattered little in an age when reputation was currency. And in the corridors of power, the name Borgia had already become a legend, a dangerous one. The poisoned chalice. Before Lucrezia departed for Ferrara, her father and brother threw one last celebration. It was meant to display their wealth and unity. Dishes were piled high, candles burned low, and the finest wines of the Vatican cellars were poured freely. What happened next would echo for generations. Several guests fell ill. Some died. Even Pope Alexander himself grew sick, as did Cesare. Whether the cause was poison, spoiled food, or simply disease, no one knew for certain. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The Borgias, who had lived by intrigue, were now consumed by it. Alexander would recover briefly, then die in August of 1503. Cesare's power waned soon after, and Lucrezia, the daughter at the center of it all, was left to navigate the ruins of her family's ambition. As she left Rome for Ferrara, she was both liberated and haunted, no longer a girl, not yet free of the shadows that bore her name. In the quiet carriage ride north, through the hills of Umbria and over the Po River, one wonders what she thought about her past. Did she mourn her father's sins, or simply accept them as part of her destiny? Did she still believe in the delicate balance of power and virtue she had tried to maintain? Or perhaps she was already thinking of Ferrara, her next chapter, her final transformation from the Pope's daughter into a duchess who would rebuild her life from the remnants of scandal. When Lucrezia Borgia crossed the border into Ferrara in early 1502, she left behind more than the marble halls of the Vatican. She left behind the weight of her father's ambitions, the blood-stained rumors of her brother, and the whispers that had turned her name into a symbol of corruption. But she did not leave her reputation behind so easily. As her entourage wound its way through the wintry Italian countryside, every town and village had heard the stories, that the Pope's daughter carried poison in her rings, that she had plotted against her husbands, that she was a witch in silk clothing. Ferrara's people waited to see what sort of woman would step out of the papal carriage. They expected danger. What they saw was calm grace. A cold welcome Ferrara was, a small but proud duchy on the northern plains of Italy, ruled by the House of Este, a family older, richer, and more respected than the Borgias could ever hope to be. The Este court was known for its refinement. Poets, painters, and philosophers filled its palaces, but it was also known for its suspicion. Alfonso d'Este, Lucrezia's new husband, was a man of discipline and machinery, more interested in gunpowder, fortifications, and engineering than in music or courtly romance. His sister, Isabella d'Este, Duchess of Mantua, was one of the most powerful women in Italy and one of Lucrezia's fiercest critics. Before Lucrezia even arrived, Isabella had written to friends that the Pope's daughter would bring shame to Ferrara. She called her infamous and warned that she would poison the Este family's honor. It was not an easy atmosphere in which to begin a new life, but Lucrezia had learned from Rome how to survive under scrutiny. She did not protest, did not argue. She arrived in Ferrara in January of 1502, dressed in gold and white, her demeanor serene, her voice soft, her smile unforced. Chroniclers say that when Alfonso first saw her, he was surprised by her modesty. It was the first step in a quiet transformation. The quiet politics of a Duchess Ferrara's court was cautious at first, but Lucrezia's intelligence and charm slowly began to dissolve the hostility around her. She spoke with diplomats, managed correspondence for her husband, and showed a keen understanding of politics that few expected. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, wrote often, sending gifts and instructions. But Lucrezia was beginning to chart her own course. For the first time in her life, she had some measure of independence. In Ferrara, she discovered a different kind of power, the power of patience. The Este family prized efficiency and order. Alfonso's court functioned like a machine. Soldiers drilled daily, artisans built cannons, and the Prince Duchess was expected to maintain dignity, faith, and decorum. Lucrezia fit herself into this rhythm with remarkable precision. She oversaw the duchy's finances when Alfonso was away. She wrote letters to ambassadors, using her papal connections to secure trade deals and alliances. Slowly, the city began to respect her. Art, faith, and reputation. Though Ferrara was smaller than Rome, its cultural life was dazzling. The poet Ludovico Ariosto, later author of Orlando Furioso, frequented the court. So did painters like Dosso Dossi and musicians from across Europe. Lucrezia became their patron. She hosted literary gatherings, encouraged the arts, and surrounded herself with scholars. In her presence, Ferrara's palace began to hum with a softer kind of ambition, the ambition of beauty, learning, and preservation. Her piety, too, impressed observers. She attended Mass daily, fasted often, and donated to convents. Over time, her public image began to shift. The same chroniclers, who once called her a poisoner, began to describe her as a saintly duchess, a model of virtue and grace. But she never entirely escaped the shadow of her name. Letters from diplomats continued to mention the Borgia daughter, often in tones of suspicion. Even when she was generous, they wondered what she wanted in return. When she mediated peace between feuding nobles, some claimed she did so with hidden motives. To live as a Borgia was to live under constant scrutiny, and yet Lucrezia managed it with poise, neither denying her past nor defending it. She simply kept moving forward, quietly rebuilding a life from the ashes of infamy. Loss and legacy. In 1503, just a year after her marriage, news reached Ferrara. Pope Alexander VI was dead. The story of his death spread quickly. Some said he had been poisoned by mistake, perhaps even by his own hand, while preparing a meal for another. Others believed it was fever. Cesare Borgia fell ill at the same time but survived, barely. Lucrezia was devastated. Whatever her father's faults, she had loved him deeply. She retreated into mourning, dressed in black, and withdrew from public life for several months. Cesare's fall soon followed. With their father gone, his military empire crumbled. By 1507, he was captured and killed in Spain. For Lucrezia, the death of her brother was both an ending and a liberation. The Borgia's name had finally lost its hold over her life, but loss would remain her constant companion. The private world of Lucrezia. Behind the polished facade of Ferrara's court, Lucrezia's personal life was complex. Her marriage to Alfonso was one of respect rather than passion. He was often away on military campaigns, and their temperaments were opposite. She, gentle and reflective. He, stern and pragmatic. Over the years, Lucrezia gave birth to several children, though many did not survive infancy. Her first daughter, Eleonora, was strong and intelligent, and would one day join a convent. Her sons Ercole and Ippolito carried on the Este lineage, but she also lost infants' tiny lives that flickered briefly and were gone. Each loss deepened her faith and her melancholy. She sought comfort in correspondence. Dozens of her letters from this period survive, written in neat, deliberate script. In them, she speaks of simple things: the weather, the health of her children, her gratitude for music and prayer. There is little bitterness in her tone, only weariness and a quiet acceptance of the burdens she carried, the return of rumors. Even in Ferrara, peace was never permanent. In 1505, a scandal erupted. It was whispered that Lucrezia had taken a lover, a poet named Pietro Bembo, whose letters to her remain among the most tender in Renaissance literature. Their relationship, though likely platonic, became a source of gossip. The letters are restrained, full of poetic affection rather than passion. "Your Excellency is the light of my thoughts, and I remain your humble servant in affection and devotion." But, for a woman of Lucrezia's past, even kindness could be misinterpreted. Ferrara's courtiers watched her closely, some admiring her, others waiting for her to fail. Yet no failure came. Instead, she continued to govern in Alfonso's absence, managed the ducal estates, and built charitable institutions. She founded the convent of Corpus Domini, where she would later seek solace in her final years. Ferrara, under siege. By 1510, Ferrara's political landscape darkened once again. The papacy, now under Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, had turned against the Este family. Julius sought to expand the papal states northward and accused Ferrara of disloyalty. The duchy became a battleground. Alfonso's fortifications were tested, and the city braced for invasion. During this crisis, Lucrezia played a critical role. She corresponded secretly with papal envoys, trying to mediate peace while supporting her husband's defense. Her letters show her balancing loyalty to Ferrara with an awareness of Rome's unpredictable might. The conflict dragged on for years. Starvation and plague crept through the countryside. Lucrezia opened the ducal granaries to feed the poor, selling her jewelry to fund relief efforts. It was during these years that the people of Ferrara stopped calling her the Pope's daughter. They began calling her our Duchess. Faith and reflection. In the later years of her life, Lucrezia's world grew smaller and quieter. The energy of her youth gave way to introspection. She withdrew often to the convent she had founded, spending long hours in prayer. Some say she wore a hair shirt beneath her fine gowns as an act of penance. Her letters became more spiritual, more reflective. She wrote of fate, forgiveness, and the impermanence of all earthly things. One letter to a close friend reads, "It is a strange thing, how peace comes not from the silence of the world, but from within the heart that has known turmoil." By this time, even her enemies spoke of her with respect. Isabella d'Este, once her fiercest critic, wrote of her grace and prudence. Ambassadors described her as wise beyond her years and most virtuous. It was as if the sins of her family had been absorbed by time and by her endurance. The final years. In 1519, at the age of 39, Lucrezia became pregnant for the last time. The pregnancy was difficult, and she grew weaker by the day. When she gave birth to a daughter, the infant lived only a few hours. Lucrezia's health collapsed soon after. As fever took hold, she requested to be moved to her convent. Surrounded by nuns and candlelight, she asked for confession, then blessed her surviving children. Her last words were reportedly a simple prayer for mercy. On the 24th of June 1519, Lucrezia Borgia died. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini, the same place where she had once found solace. Her tomb remains there today. A modest stone slab, unadorned, marked only by her name. From infamy to serenity, over the centuries, her story has been retold in countless ways. As a villainess, a temptress, a pawn, and a saint. Painters imagined her with poison vials. Poets wrote of her as a symbol of Renaissance corruption. But the truth is quieter. Lucrezia Borgia was a woman shaped by power and forced to survive within it. She learned to speak softly where others shouted, to endure where others schemed. Her life was neither heroic nor wicked. It was human, complex, and deeply intertwined with the restless politics of her age. And in the end, it was that humanity, not the rumors, that endured. Still, one wonders, when she lay in her final hours, did she ever think of Rome again? Did she remember the corridors of the Vatican, her father's voice, the candlelight glinting off golden chalices? Did she forgive them all, or did she finally forgive herself? If you were to walk today through the quiet streets of Ferrara, you might not even notice her resting place. The convent of Corpus Domini stands modestly near the old city walls, its brick facade softened by centuries of sunlight. Inside, behind the choir stalls, lies a simple tombstone. The inscription is faint. It bears only a name: Lucrezia Borgia. No marble angels, no grand epitaphs, just stillness. It seems almost ironic that the woman once accused of every conceivable sin was given one of the humblest graves in Renaissance Italy. But perhaps that is fitting, for in death, Lucrezia found what she had rarely known in life: peace, the shadow that would not fade. In the years following her death, Ferrara changed little, but the world beyond its walls did not forget her. The name Borgia had become too famous, too convenient for storytellers, to fade quietly into history. Pope Alexander VI remained infamous as the archetype of corruption. Cesare, the ruthless commander, lived on in legend as the model for Machiavelli's The Prince. And Lucrezia, well, she became a symbol, but not of who she really was. The chroniclers of her age, mostly men of rival courts and hostile families, shaped her image with words that carried more venom than fact. Venetian ambassadors described her as subtle and dangerous. French pamphlets called her the Enchantress of Rome. Even decades later, historians repeated the same stories: that she hosted secret orgies in the Vatican, that she carried poison concealed in jeweled rings, that she was complicit in her family's murders. Yet, if one looks closer, the evidence for these claims is almost non-existent. Not a single contemporary document proves that Lucrezia ever poisoned anyone. Not one credible witness accused her of a crime. Most of the tales began as political slander tools for her enemies to tarnish the Borgia's name. Still, slander can be more enduring than truth, rewriting a reputation. In the centuries that followed, the story of Lucrezia Borgia shifted with the times. The Enlightenment dismissed her as a relic of superstition and papal excess. The Romantics of the 19th century resurrected her as a tragic beauty, a woman both victim and villain. Victor Hugo wrote a play about her. Donizetti turned her into an opera heroine. Painters depicted her pale and sorrowful, holding goblets of poison or letters of forbidden love. It was as if every generation needed her for something different. To some, she was a warning against female ambition. To others, a misunderstood saint. The real Lucrezia was buried beneath centuries of projection. But now, with the slow patience of historians, fragments of her real life have begun to resurface. Letters, financial records, and court documents reveal a woman who was pragmatic, compassionate, and remarkably competent. We know, for example, that during her time as Duchess, she established one of Ferrara's first public hospitals. We know she managed the city's finances with careful attention, increasing the ducal revenues while supporting artists and convents. We know she personally wrote to widows and merchants, ensuring that disputes were settled fairly. And we know she read the poets of her time, Petrarch, Dante, and new humanist writers, finding in their verses a form of quiet companionship. These are not the acts of a poisoner. They are the acts of a woman trying to leave a gentler mark on the world than the one her family had carved. The burden of being a Borgia. To understand Lucrezia, one must understand the era she lived in. The Renaissance is often remembered for art and genius, the brilliance of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. But it was also an age of relentless instability. Italy was not a unified country, but a patchwork of competing city-states, each ruled by families bound to shifting alliances. Assassination and betrayal were as common as trade. To survive in that world required a kind of moral flexibility. The Borgias, foreigners from Spain, had clawed their way to the top of this dangerous hierarchy. For Rodrigo Borgia, the papal throne was both a triumph and a trap. Every action he took as pope, every appointment, every favor was seen as nepotism, every success as corruption. His children inherited both his ambition and his enemies. Cesare, brilliant and cruel, became the face of their military might. Lucrezia, though innocent of political crimes, became the face of their moral corruption, because she was visible, because she was a woman. In an age where power was masculine, her influence was unnerving. She could charm nobles, mediate treaties, and gain audiences with kings. That alone made her dangerous in the eyes of men who distrusted what they could not control. Her femininity became the battlefield on which her family's reputation was fought. Lucrezia and the myth of the femme fatale. It is strange how history often turns capable women into symbols of temptation. In the centuries after her death, Lucrezia was transformed into what modern historians call the femme fatale archetype, the beautiful woman who destroys those around her. She joined a long list that included Eve, Helen of Troy, and Cleopatra. But the myth says more about those who wrote it than about her. Renaissance writers, deeply steeped in moral allegory, found it easier to frame Lucrezia as a warning than as a person. A beautiful woman who escaped punishment unsettled them. A beautiful woman who gained power frightened them. And so, they did what writers have often done to women who complicate the narrative. They made her monstrous. They turned her intelligence into cunning, her diplomacy into deceit, her composure into manipulation. In truth, Lucrezia's life was not that of a seductress, but of a survivor. Each marriage, each alliance, each shift in power required her to adapt. Her beauty, which history so often fixated on, was less a weapon than a mask, one she was forced to wear to navigate a world designed to use her. Behind that mask was a woman who, by all evidence, longed for stability, family, and faith. Ferrara's memory. In Ferrara, time moved differently. The city never forgot its duchess, but it remembered her, not with scandal, but with quiet pride. She had brought prosperity to the region during difficult years. Under her guidance, Ferrara became a haven for artists and thinkers, fleeing the chaos of war-torn Italy. The court she built with Alfonso d'Este rivaled Florence in culture and refinement. Even long after her death, Ferrara's citizens spoke of her kindness. She was remembered for visiting hospitals during outbreaks of plague, for granting audience to commoners, and for funding schools for orphaned girls. In the convent where she was buried, nuns preserved her memory with reverence. A 17th century abbess wrote, "The Duchess was to us a second mother, humble among her sisters, constant in her faith." This was the Lucrezia, known to those who actually lived under her rule. Not the legend of poison and intrigue, but a woman who found peace through devotion and service. Modern reappraisal. In recent decades, historians have begun to reconstruct a more balanced portrait of Lucrezia Borgia. Archival studies show that her letters reveal a steady, organized mind. They show compassion for the poor and a keen understanding of economics. She emerges not as a victim or villain, but as an early example of female leadership in a patriarchal world. She was, in her own quiet way, a political figure, using diplomacy instead of warfare, persuasion instead of force. One letter from 1508, addressed to her husband Alfonso, shows her clarity of judgment. We must not think only of the sword, for a duchy is not maintained by iron alone. The hearts of the people are the true walls of our defense. That sentence, understated yet profound, captures her essence. Lucrezia's legacy, once buried under gossip, now invites admiration for her endurance. She represents the many women of her age whose intelligence was dismissed, whose choices were constrained, and whose strength was mistaken for deceit. The Borgia echo. Even so, the Borgia legend endures. It is too enticing to die completely. Films, novels, and television dramas still return to her story, dressing her in velvet and shadows. She is portrayed alternately as seductress, saint, or strategist. And while these portrayals keep her name alive, they also remind us of how fragile truth becomes when filtered through fascination. But perhaps that is the irony of history. It rarely rewards accuracy, only memory. And Lucrezia Borgia, for all her attempts to live quietly, has been remembered more vividly than most. If you walk into a museum today, you might find her face in a portrait serene, thoughtful, her hands folded in her lap. You might not even recognize her unless you read the small inscription below. But there she is, calm, collected, and utterly composed. It is that image, not the lurid tales, that feels truest to who she was, the quiet meaning of her life. When one reflects on Lucrezia's journey from the turbulent corridors of the Vatican to the contemplative silence of a convent, there is something profoundly human in it. Hers is not the story of grandeur or conquest, but of endurance amid misunderstanding. She lived at the intersection of politics, gender, and myth. An intersection where few women could survive, and even fewer could emerge with dignity. In her ability to adapt, to endure slander without surrendering to bitterness, she demonstrated a form of strength far subtler than that of her father or brother. They sought to command history. She sought to live within it. And in the long run, hers may be the greater victory. For while Alexander and Cesare became cautionary tales of excess and ambition, Lucrezia became something else, entirely a testament to transformation. Epilogue, the stillness of legacy. In the dim chapel of Corpus Domini, Lucrezia's tomb remains surrounded by quiet devotion. Visitors leave flowers there, roses, mostly, for no reason other than that they seem appropriate. If you linger long enough, you can almost imagine her presence, not the Pope's daughter, not the poisoner of legend, but a woman sitting by candlelight, writing a letter she knows few will ever read. The ink dries slowly. Outside, the city hums with the sound of bells. She pauses, dips her pen again, and continues. In the end, perhaps that is her truest legacy. The quiet persistence of a woman writing her own history, even as others tried to write it for her. Centuries later, as historians re-examine her life, they find not a tale of intrigue, but of endurance. And so the question remains, what does it mean to be remembered for what others feared you might be, rather than for what you truly were? Perhaps Lucrezia Borgia, buried beneath centuries of rumor, has already answered it. To live is to be misunderstood, but to endure in memory is to prevail. If you travel far enough into the Sahara, where the dunes ripple like waves frozen in mid-motion, there lies a city whose history was written not on stone, but on paper. Timbuktu, a name that now sounds mythical, almost like a metaphor for remoteness, was once the quiet heart of learning in medieval Africa. It was not a city of warriors or kings, but of scribes, scholars and traders, each moving under the heavy heat with a book in one hand and a bundle of manuscripts under the other arm. You can imagine the dust fine, golden, persistent. It would coat everything. The wooden doors carved with geometric designs, the narrow streets where donkeys moved slowly, the fingers of the scholars turning pages of worn parchment. The air carried the soft sound of quills on paper and the distant echo of a muezzin's call to prayer, mixing with shuffling of sandals in the sand. But to understand Timbuktu, you have to start long before it became a city of books. The Sahara, contrary to what it might seem, was not a barrier. It was a highway, a vast, shifting sea, crossed by caravans. The Tuareg people, who moved through the dunes with camels and patience, were the navigators of this world. They carried salt from the mines of Tagaza, gold from the forests of the south, and stories, always stories, from the edges of the known world. By the 12th century, the city of Timbuktu had begun as a small encampment along the Niger River, a place of rest for traders who could not go farther into the desert before nightfall. It was founded, they say, by a Tuareg woman named Buktu, who kept a well for passing travelers. The name Timbuktu means the place of Buktu. It was not a royal city, not at first. It was a well in the sand. And yet, around that well, one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world quietly emerged. The merchants came first, then came the scholars. By the 14th century, when the city fell under the rule of the Mali Empire, Timbuktu had transformed into a sanctuary for books. Gold passed through its markets, yes, but the true treasure was knowledge. Here, merchants from Cairo and Fez traded manuscripts alongside salt and spices. A book copied by hand could be worth more than a caravan of camels. It is difficult, from the vantage point of modern life, to imagine the labor that went into each page. The scribes, many of them trained since childhood, prepared parchment from goatskin or imported paper from North Africa. They sharpened reeds into pens, mixed soot and gum Arabic into ink, and wrote in careful Arabic script under the dim light of oil lamps. They copied treatises on astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, and poetry. Some were devout, recording Quranic commentaries. Others wrote of trade routes, rainfall, and medicinal plants. Every manuscript was a small defiance of time and forgetting. Timbuktu's intellectual world revolved around its three great mosques, Jingueraba, Sankore, and Sidi Yahya. Each was both a house of worship and a university, where scholars debated theology and mathematics in the same breath. The Sankore Mosque, built in the 14th century, became the core of what would later be called the University of Sankore, though it bore little resemblance to European universities. There were no printed degrees, no official buildings beyond the shaded courtyards. Learning was transmitted through the spoken word, through the teacher's patience and the student's memory. Knowledge lived in people, not in institutions. At its height, it is said that Timbuktu housed tens of thousands of manuscripts, perhaps even more than some European libraries of the same period. A visiting scholar from Fez once wrote that he found books there, more numerous than in any other place in the world. But it was not the number of books that mattered. It was the spirit in which they were kept. Quiet, reverence, gentle persistence. The scholars of Timbuktu were not flamboyant. They did not seek fame. They saw learning as a form of devotion, an act of humility before God's creation. Some spent their lives copying the same text, refining its calligraphy, annotating its margins. Others compiled their own treatises, often unsigned. One of the most respected scholars, Ahmed Baba, who lived in the 16th century, wrote more than 40 books, but considered himself a humble student. When he was exiled by Moroccan invaders, his greatest sorrow was not the loss of home, but the loss of his 1,000 600-volume library. There is something deeply human in that, to grieve not for land or gold, but for books. And yet, for all its learning, Timbuktu was never loud about its greatness. It thrived in silence. The city's wealth was measured not in monuments, but in manuscripts hidden in clay chests, stored in dark rooms to protect them from the desert air. Families guarded their collections for generations, passing them from father to son, mother to daughter, as if knowledge itself were an heirloom. The climate of the Sahara, harsh as it was, became both a curse and a blessing. The dryness preserved the paper, but it also isolated the city. The caravans grew fewer as trade routes shifted and empires rose and fell. The once bustling streets became quieter. The scholars aged. Their books gathered dust. You can still imagine a day in that time, perhaps the late 15th century, when a young student sat cross-legged beneath a clay wall, listening to his teacher recite passages from a book on astronomy. Outside, camels groaned under the weight of salt blocks, and the air shimmered with heat. The student might have dreamed of Cairo, or Mecca, or the faraway lands described in the manuscripts, places he would never see, except through words. He would return home at dusk, ink-stained, fingers clutching his notes, a candle stub flickering beside him. The beauty of Timbuktu's story lies in its ordinariness. No grand wars were fought for its knowledge. No single hero saved it. It was built, sustained, and protected by countless small acts of devotion, the steady hand of a scribe, the patience of a teacher, the discipline of a student who stayed awake long after sunset to memorize a verse. But history, as it often does, would turn. In the late 16th century, Moroccan forces crossed the desert under the orders of Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur. Their goal was gold, not knowledge. They invaded Timbuktu in 1591, bringing muskets against scholars. Libraries were looted, books were burned, stolen, or carried away as curiosities. Ahmed Baba was taken prisoner and exiled to Morocco. The city that had thrived on learning found itself suddenly silenced. And yet, even in that silence, the manuscripts endured, hidden in walls, buried under sand, stored in wooden chests. They survived centuries of neglect. When the French arrived in the 19th century, they found a city faded but not forgotten. The scribes were gone, but their words remained. To this day, many of those manuscripts have not been read. They sit quietly, waiting. The ink has faded, the pages are brittle, but the words are still there. As the sun sets over the dunes and the call to prayer drifts across the old walls, one might ask, if a civilization preserves its words but loses its voice, is it truly gone? Or does it simply wait, as Timbuktu does, for someone to listen again? If you were to walk through the narrow alleys of Timbuktu in its golden age, sometime between the 14th and 16th centuries, you would have heard the sound of soft scratching, the faint, rhythmic whisper of reed pens moving over parchment. It was a sound so ordinary that most would not notice it, but that sound was the heartbeat of the city. The scribes of Timbuktu were not nobles, though. Some served them. They were artisans of thought, craftsmen of memory. Their workshops were simple: low-ceilinged rooms with walls of clay, wooden beams blackened by smoke, a small window letting in just enough light to work by. The floor was covered with mats. Ink pots sat in shallow bowls made from carved gourds. The tools were few, but the skill was vast. In the city's quiet hum, the making of ink was an art passed down through families. It was said that a good scribe could tell where an ink came from by its smell. The recipe was a blend of soot, gum, Arabic, and sometimes powdered charcoal from specific trees, acacia, tamarind, or palm, depending on the desired texture. The gum, harvested from the bark, bound the pigment to the page, while the soot gave it permanence. When mixed properly, the ink shimmered faintly in the light, a subtle sheen that caught the eye. Before writing, the scribe would perform ablution, cleansing his hands and face in a small bowl of water. Then he would murmur a prayer, a simple invocation, that the words he copied be preserved, not only in paper, but in spirit. He would sit cross-legged, steady his hand, and begin. The Arabic calligraphy used in Timbuktu manuscripts was not always ornate. It was functional, flowing, and slightly tilted. The letters were often accompanied by marginal notes, sometimes in smaller script, written by later generations. These notes told small stories of ownership, of study, of lineage. This book belongs to Ahmad, son of Mahmud, copied by his own hand in the month of Ramadan. This was read by Fatima, daughter of Ali, under the teaching of the scholar Al-Sadi. Each line was not just text, it was an echo of lives that had touched it. The manuscripts covered an astonishing range of subjects. The most common were religious Quranic exegesis, hadith, and Islamic law. But alongside them were treatises on medicine, astronomy, arithmetic, and grammar. There were even manuscripts on trade practices, detailed notes on caravan routes, pricing systems, and the ethics of business. Timbuktu's scholars did not separate the sacred from the practical. To understand commerce was, in a sense, to understand creation. Among the most celebrated scholars was Mahmud Kati, whose Tariq al-Fatash chronicled the history of West Africa in meticulous detail. His grandson continued his work, updating the chronicle as dynasties rose and fell. The Tariq al-Sudan, another chronicle written by Abdurrahman al-Sadi, described rulers and scholars alike, not as myths, but as men. Their works remind us that African history was being recorded from within, in ink and observation, centuries before European colonizers arrived with their own narratives. The city's universities were not formal in the modern sense. The scholar's home was his classroom. Lessons took place under trees, in courtyards, or inside the cool, dim shade of a mosque. Students gathered on mats, holding wooden boards on which they copied verses or formulas. A session might last hours, broken only by prayer or the call of a passing muezzin. The teacher would dictate slowly, repeating a phrase until the students murmured it in unison. Knowledge was sound before it became text. Sometimes, when a student could not afford paper, he would memorize entire texts. The oral tradition intertwined with the written, each reinforcing the other. Timbuktu was a city of paper, yes, but also a city of memory. It is easy to romanticize such devotion, but the life of a scholar here was not glamorous. There were no vast estates, no royal titles. Many lived in poverty, sustained by small donations from the community or by teaching in exchange for food. Some copied books for wealthy patrons, others traded manuscripts for necessities. Their work was slow, their days long, and their eyes strained from reading by candlelight. And yet, in that labor, there was a kind of peace, a quiet certainty that what they were doing mattered. Knowledge was not a means to power, but a form of service. Travelers who came to Timbuktu often wrote of its strangeness, a city in the middle of the desert, filled with books. When Leo Africanus, the Andalusian traveller, visited in the early 1500s, he noted that there are many judges, teachers, and priests, and more manuscripts are sold here than in any other place in Africa. What struck him most was not wealth, but the reverence for learning. Even merchants, he said, would pause to discuss theology before returning to trade. The city's rhythm followed the cycle of the desert. The mornings were cool, the afternoons sweltering. The streets emptied when the heat peaked, and life resumed in the evening when the air softened. At night, the stars over the Sahara seemed impossibly bright, a canopy of light so vast that astronomers could trace their calculations directly above their heads. Many of Timbuktu's manuscripts on astronomy were practical, charting the lunar cycles, the direction of Mecca, and the timing of seasons. But others ventured into philosophy, wondering aloud at the structure of the heavens. In one manuscript, a marginal note reads, "The stars move as if in worship, though they have no tongues. The scribe's name is lost, but his thought endures an anonymous reflection, preserved for centuries." When the Moroccan invasion came in 1591, led by Judar Pasha, a Spanish convert commanding the Sultan's troops, Timbuktu's golden age began to wane. Muskets met resistance with spears. The scholars were unarmed. Their books were seized as trophies. Their libraries plundered for their novelty. To the invaders, the manuscripts were curiosities, not treasures. Many were burned for their bindings, which contained traces of gold leaf. Ahmed Baba, perhaps the city's greatest scholar, was taken north to Marrakesh. There, he was interrogated and humiliated, his works scattered. But even in exile, he wrote treatises on law, philosophy, and resistance. He is said to have once told his captors, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." His words capture the spirit of Timbuktu more perfectly than any monument could. When he was finally released and allowed to return, the city he found was subdued. The trade routes that had once connected Timbuktu to Cairo, Tripoli, and Fez were dwindling. The Sahara, once a highway, became a barrier again. Without trade, knowledge lost its carriers. Scholars grew old. Libraries were sealed away. But the manuscripts, the quiet, fragile witnesses of centuries, remained. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, as European explorers arrived in Africa, rumors of a city of gold persisted. When the French finally reached Timbuktu in the 1800s, they found not gold, but dust, manuscripts, and silence. Some were disappointed. Others were awed. They did not understand what they had found. For the people of Timbuktu, the manuscripts were not relics. They were living memory. Each family guarded its collection with reverence, often hiding them in earthen jars or sealed boxes. In some houses, the oldest manuscripts were buried under floors to protect them from moisture and theft. It is said that in the early 20th century, a local librarian uncovered a manuscript buried beneath his courtyard. Its pages were intact, its ink still visible. It had lain there for centuries, sleeping. Knowledge in Timbuktu was not lost. It merely learned to wait. In the silence that followed centuries of upheaval, the question lingers. When the last scribe's pen fell silent, did the desert win, or did the manuscripts, quietly surviving beneath the sand, write the final word instead? By the time the 20th century arrived, Timbuktu was no longer a city of scholars. It was a place of memory. The desert had crept closer. The river had shifted its course. The streets that had once echoed with the murmur of lessons were quiet. And the clay mosques stood, as they always had, humble, eroding slightly each year, then repaired again by hands that had never forgotten how to mix the right kind of mud. The world around Timbuktu had changed. Steamships replaced caravans. Maps redrew Africa into lines of colonial rule. And in those distant capitals, Paris, London, Berlin, the scholars who studied history often wrote as if Africa had none. They spoke of it as a place of tribes and wilderness, of lands discovered and civilized. Few of them knew that 1,000 miles deep in the desert, there were libraries that had already chronicled the rise and fall of empires, centuries before Europe's explorers were even born. The people of Timbuktu knew, though. They always had. They had simply stopped speaking about it. It was during the French colonial period that the manuscripts began to draw foreign attention once again. French officers stationed in the Sahara occasionally came across old texts in Arabic script, sometimes for sale, sometimes offered as gifts. A few were taken to museums or universities. They were labelled curiosities, evidence that perhaps Africa had once had literacy, as though that were a revelation. But the families who still kept manuscripts knew better than to share them freely. They had inherited not only paper, but caution. Stories of looting by invaders, explorers, even well-meaning scholars had been passed down like warnings. Many houses in Timbuktu still held secret rooms where manuscripts were stored. In some homes, the oldest collections were buried underground, hidden beneath floorboards, wrapped in goat skins, and sealed with clay. The manuscripts slept. For decades, few outsiders knew the scale of what lay beneath the dust. It was not until the mid-20th century that researchers began to grasp the enormity of it. When cataloguing began, scholars estimated that Timbuktu held not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of manuscripts spanning law, astronomy, theology, medicine, poetry, and history. Some were written in Arabic, others in Songhai, Fulani, or Tamashek, transcribed in Arabic script. The oldest dated back nearly a millennium. The revelation challenged every colonial narrative about African illiteracy. Here was written proof patient, undeniable proof that Africa had its own intellectual traditions, its own universities, its own philosophers. The manuscripts told of trade networks that connected sub-Saharan kingdoms with the Mediterranean and beyond, of scholars debating Aristotelian logic beside Quranic exegesis, of physicians prescribing treatments for ailments centuries before Western medicine reached the region. But perhaps the most profound thing about them was their ordinariness. They were not grand proclamations or royal decrees. Many were personal notebooks, everyday reflections, copies of lessons, or legal opinions written for local disputes. They captured life not as spectacle, but as routine, the small details that make civilization real. In that way, they were the very essence of boring history, the kind that never makes headlines, yet sustains the world quietly. In the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, a new generation of Malian scholars and librarians began the slow, meticulous work of preserving this written heritage. Men like Abdelkader Haidara, who inherited his father's private collection, dedicated their lives to finding, cataloguing, and safeguarding manuscripts scattered across the region. Haidara travelled by boat and by camel, convincing families to let him see their hidden treasures. Many were suspicious at first, afraid that outsiders would take their manuscripts away, but Haidara's patience earned trust. Slowly, the manuscripts emerged from their hiding places, dusty trunks, sealed jars, attics filled with sand. Each one carried the scent of age, dry parchment, old ink, a faint trace of smoke from centuries of oil lamps. In the 1,990 seconds, international attention finally turned toward Timbuktu's libraries. Institutions from around the world began to offer support for preservation. Climate-controlled archives were established, and digitization efforts began. For a time, it seemed as though the manuscripts would finally rest safely, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. But history, as it so often does, repeated itself. In 2012, more than 400 years after the Moroccan invasion that had first scattered Timbuktu's scholars, the city once again fell under threat. This time, Islamist militants swept across northern Mali. They declared the city part of a new caliphate, and as in so many revolutions before, books became dangerous. Libraries were burned. Shrines were destroyed. The air filled once again with smoke and dust. It could have been the end, but in a remarkable echo of the past, the people of Timbuktu responded the way their ancestors had centuries before. They hid the books. Under cover of night, librarians, families, and volunteers smuggled hundreds of thousands of manuscripts out of the city. They used wooden crates, metal trunks, even rice sacks. Some were carried by donkey carts. Others were loaded into small boats that floated silently down the Niger River toward Bamako. The operation lasted months. The risk was immense. A single discovery could have meant imprisonment or death. But they persisted. When the militants were finally driven out, most of the manuscripts had been saved, a modern miracle of quiet defiance. Today, those same manuscripts are being preserved, restored, and digitized. Many are housed in the Ahmed Baba Institute, named for the scholar who once wept for his lost library. Others remain in private family collections, still guarded with the same reverence as before. Some pages are nearly unreadable, faded ink, water stains, insect damage. Others are astonishingly clear, the handwriting neat and confident, as if the scribe had just put down his pen moments ago. The manuscripts have traveled centuries, outlasting empires, invasions, and neglect. They have survived precisely because they were never meant to be monuments. They were meant to be used, read, copied, passed on, and then, when danger came, hidden until it was safe again. Each page is a quiet testimony to endurance. To read one of those manuscripts today is to hear a whisper from another age, the echo of a scribe bent over his page, the sound of reed on parchment, the creak of a wooden stool. It is to see the patience of a civilization that understood something our fast-moving world often forgets. That wisdom is not loud, and progress is not always visible. Timbuktu's scholars may not have known that they were preserving the intellectual foundation of a continent. They were simply doing their duty, one letter at a time, one line at a time, one prayer at a time. The desert winds still blow over Timbuktu, the sand shifting endlessly, covering and uncovering traces of the past. But beneath it all, the manuscripts remain. Their words about stars, trade, law, and God are still alive. They wait, as they always have, for readers patient enough to listen. And perhaps that is the lesson of Timbuktu, that civilization does not end when its walls fall or its rulers vanish. It endures wherever memory is written, even in ink made from soot and gum, even beneath centuries of dust. As the desert cools under the stars, and the night wind moves gently over the old mosques, one might ask, if the words of the dead can survive the silence of centuries, what will become of ours now scattered across the endless sands of the digital world? If you close your eyes and imagine medieval Europe, you might think first of castles, crusaders, and kings. But if you listen a little longer, beyond the clang of armor and the echo of sermons, you will hear another sound, the steady creak of wooden ships, the rhythmic splash of oars, and the faint rustle of parchment as a clerk tallies numbers by candlelight. This is the quieter history of power, not won by conquest, but by contract, not carved in stone, but inked in ledgers. Between the 13th and 17th centuries, a network of merchants along the cold waters of the Baltic and North Seas built one of the most remarkable alliances in European history, the Hanseatic League. It had no king, no army in the traditional sense, and no borders. And yet, for nearly 300 years, it controlled the flow of goods, and therefore, the fate of nations. It began simply enough. In the 1100s, small trading settlements dotted the shores of the Baltic: Lübeck, Bremen, Hamburg, Riga, Tallinn, Visby. They were coastal towns born from necessity, where fishermen, shipbuilders, and traders met at the edge of the sea. The waters were dangerous, the winters long, and the pirates many. Merchants who travelled alone were easy prey. So they began to form associations, guilds for protection, cooperation, and mutual defence. What started as local brotherhoods soon became something larger. By the 13th century, the merchants of Lübeck, a city often called the Queen of the Hansa, took the lead in uniting these towns. They built warehouses and trading posts from Novgorod to London, from Bergen to Bruges. They called themselves Die Hanse, from the old German word for association. Their purpose was practical: to make trade safer, cheaper, and predictable in a world where storms, pirates, and taxes were constant threats. The Hanseatic League had no grand charter declaring its birth. It grew quietly, as trade does, through agreements, letters, and habits. Towns joined by sending representatives to Lübeck's annual gatherings, the Hansetage, or Hanseatic Diets. There, in wooden halls smelling of tar and salt, merchants debated tariffs, tolls, and shipping rights. Each city spoke for itself, but decisions were made collectively. In a time when kings ruled by divine right, the Hanseatic League ruled by consensus and calculation. Its real power was invisible. Imagine a single ship leaving Lübeck in the late 1300s. It is a cog, a sturdy, round-bellied vessel with one great square sail and a small crew. The hull creaks as barrels of beer and wax are rolled aboard. Crates of linen from Flanders are stacked beside timber from the Baltic forests. Somewhere in the hold lies a chest of coins, carefully sealed, bearing the mark of the Hanseatic Guild. The ship will sail north through the Kattegat and Skagerrak, past Denmark's toll posts at the Øresund, then out into the grey vastness of the North Sea. Its destination might be London, or Bergen, or even the icy markets of Novgorod in modern-day Russia. The voyage will take weeks, sometimes months. The crew will face storms, ice, and pirates. But when they arrive, they will find something extraordinary waiting. Hanseatic trading posts, contours, already established, already organized, already ready. In Bergen, the Briggen Wharf housed Hanseatic merchants in long wooden buildings painted red and yellow, their narrow facades facing the harbour. They lived and worked there. A community of Germans in a Norwegian city, bound by strict rules. No women were allowed in the compound. No local language was spoken inside. Every deal was logged, every shipment weighed. In Novgorod, the Hanseatic merchants traded for furs, wax, and honey, the luxuries of the northern forests. The Russian traders called them Nemtsi, the silent ones, because they spoke little and dealt mostly through written contracts. Even in the frozen reaches of winter, when the river turned to ice, the merchants met to balance accounts, seal letters, and share news of distant markets. Their discipline was their strength. The Hanseatic League thrived not because it was mighty, but because it was meticulous. Its greatest weapon was paperwork. Every shipment, every toll, every complaint was recorded. In a time when most of Europe's power depended on swords, the League's power depended on ink. Its reach extended beyond trade. The League negotiated treaties with kings, demanded compensation for piracy, and occasionally waged war. Though reluctantly, when King Waldemar IV of Denmark tried to control Baltic trade in the 14th century, the Hanseatic cities united against him. Their combined fleets besieged Copenhagen and forced him into submission. But even then, the merchants preferred to sign peace treaties rather than celebrate victories. War, after all, disrupted commerce. For nearly 2 centuries, the League was an empire without emperors. Its cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Rostock, Riga, Danzig, and dozens more, were connected not by armies, but by promises. A merchant from Lübeck could travel to Riga and be treated as a local citizen. Disputes were settled by Hanseatic law. Their seal, a twin-headed eagle grasping a key, carried more authority in Northern Europe than most royal banners. But the daily reality of this empire was far from glamorous. In a warehouse in Lübeck, a clerk might spend his entire life balancing accounts that would never bear his name. He would wake before dawn, light a candle, and begin to copy figures from one ledger to another. Ships came and went, captains shouted orders, and dockhands rolled barrels through the mud. The clerk never saw the sea, though his numbers moved across it. He calculated exchange rates for Riga, listed freight costs for Danzig, and adjusted tariffs according to new treaties from Bruges. When he made a mistake, he scraped the ink from the parchment with a knife, polished the spot with sand, and began again. The margin of error was small, but the work was endless. This was the quiet machinery of the Hanseatic world, a web of calculations that kept thousands of ships moving in rhythm. Every figure mattered. A misplaced decimal could ruin a voyage. For most merchants, profit was not measured in treasure, but in stability. The League's motto, though never officially recorded, could have been this: better slow certainty than fast chaos. It was this patience, this commitment to balance and order, that allowed the Hanseatic League to outlast so many kingdoms. And yet, like all systems built on precision, it depended on the constancy of its world. The sea, the markets, the trust, all had to hold. By the end of the 15th century, cracks began to appear. New routes opened to the Atlantic. England, Spain, and Portugal built powerful navies and reached across oceans that the Hanseatic merchants never dared to cross. Trade shifted from the Baltic to the world beyond. The League, slow to adapt, began to fade. But for now, in this part of the story, the height of its power, the sea, belongs to the merchants. The wind carries their ships, the docks echo with their counting, and the cities sleep beneath their quiet. Empire of trade. They do not know yet that they are building something that will soon be forgotten, an empire of trust, drowned not by war, but by time. As the last ships leave Lübeck's harbour at dusk, their sails glowing red in the evening light, one might wonder, if power can exist without kings or armies, held together only by trust and ledgers, can it ever truly last? By the middle of the 14th century, the Hanseatic League had become a presence so vast and intricate that it seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. There were no coronations, no palaces, and no golden thrones. There was only order, a quiet rhythm of ships arriving, goods exchanged, and ledgers balanced. Its banners did not fly above battlefields, but above warehouses. Its triumphs were measured not in land won, but in routes maintained. Yet beneath the smooth surface of this commercial sea, there was constant movement. The human tide of merchants, clerks, apprentices, sailors, and brokers who made the League function. Their world was one of patience and precision, where the smallest misjudgment could ripple across thousands of miles of trade routes. At the center of this invisible empire stood Lübeck, the so-called Queen of the Hansa. From here, the flow of commerce was coordinated, like the turning of gears in a vast, unseen clock. Each city in the League, Hamburg, Riga, Danzig, Reval, Bergen, Bruges, played its part. But Lübeck's merchants were the mechanism. They met in long timbered halls that smelled of wax and salt water, sitting over scrolls filled with marks and measurements. It was here that they discussed not conquests, but consistency, tariffs, tolls, shipping routes, guild regulations, and codes of conduct. This was not the language of kings. It was the language of trust. To belong to the Hanse was to live by rules, hundreds of them, written and unwritten. Every merchant had to swear loyalty, not only to his city, but to the collective reputation of the League. A dishonest deal in Novgorod could cause a backlash in Bruges. A single forged document could unravel years of negotiation. To prevent such failures, the League relied on something remarkably fragile: honor bound by paper. Contracts were written in triplicate, sealed with wax, and signed under witnesses. Letters of credit replaced coins on long journeys, making trade faster, but also more dependent on honesty. A merchant from Riga could present a letter in London and receive payment without ever showing gold, a practice that required trust, not only in the man, but in the system that vouched for him. And so, trust became a kind of currency, but it was not evenly distributed. At the height of the League's influence, its reach stretched from the Russian forests to the English ports, from Scandinavian fisheries to German workshops. Within that reach lived many peoples: Germans, Danes, Swedes, Finns, Russians, Balts, and Slavs. Yet the League itself remained stubbornly German in language, law, and temperament. In places like Bergen, the Hanseatic merchants lived apart from locals. Their compound, the Briggen, was a world unto itself. Long rows of wooden buildings with steep roofs and narrow corridors. The men slept in bunks stacked 3 high, ate meals together at communal tables, and were forbidden from marrying or mingling with the Norwegians. The rules were strict. No women, no personal trade, no gambling, no local friendships. The isolation was both protection and prison. Inside the Briggen, life followed a clockwork pattern. Ships arrived with grain, beer, and cloth. They left with dried cod, whale oil, and hides. Every barrel was weighed, every coin counted. Young apprentices, some barely in their teens, learned the art of trade from elder merchants, how to measure grain, how to assess timber, how to calculate profit after tariffs. The work was repetitive but essential. In the evenings, when the sun set over the fjord, the merchants would light candles and record the day's numbers in the communal ledger, their handwriting small and precise, like rows of soldiers. The older men would speak quietly of market trends in Danzig or the price of salt in Lüneburg. There was comfort in the repetition, a sense of belonging to something vast and orderly. Yet beneath it lingered a kind of weariness, the fatigue of men who had dedicated their lives to maintaining equilibrium in a world that was always shifting. In Bruges, the League's contour, or trading post, was different. It sat in the heart of a bustling city, surrounded by canals and market squares, filled with French cloth and English wool. Bruges was Europe's financial hub, and here, the Hanseatic merchants were both respected and resented. They were efficient, disciplined, and secretive. They operated as one body, negotiating collectively, refusing to be drawn into the personal politics of princes and dukes. When local officials tried to raise taxes, the Hanse merchants simply closed their warehouses and left the city, taking their trade and the city's prosperity with them. It was an elegant form of warfare, the strike of absence. The power of the League was thus both moral and practical. They could not be conquered easily, for they had no territory to seize. They could not be taxed without consent, for they could always move their trade elsewhere. The League existed everywhere and nowhere, its authority diffused across ports and markets, its wealth spread across the sea. And yet, for all its success, the cracks were already visible. Within the League's meetings, smaller cities began to question Lübeck's dominance. Should one port speak for all? Should Hamburg, with its growing Atlantic connections, obey the same laws as Riga, bound to the frozen east? The merchants debated these questions endlessly, but always in the same manner, quietly, through motions, ledgers, and letters. Preserved peace, but it also slowed change. Outside their walls, the world was transforming. In England, the Tudor monarchs began to assert control over foreign traders, demanding licenses and tariffs that favoured local merchants. In the Low Countries, the rise of Antwerp as a modern financial centre began to eclipse Bruges, and with it, the Hanseatic presence there. But the merchants of Lübeck were slow to see the danger. They believed that trust and patience would outlast novelty and risk. For generations, it had. Still, storms were brewing. The Baltic itself was changing. Denmark, Sweden, and Poland were consolidating into more centralized kingdoms. National fleets began to patrol waters once dominated by Hanseatic ships. Piracy, once manageable, grew violent and unpredictable. The Victual Brothers, a band of privateers originally hired by the League during the Danish Wars, turned rogue, plundering the very ships they had once protected. For merchants accustomed to order, this chaos was intolerable. In 1367, Lübeck led a coalition of Hanseatic cities into open conflict with Denmark, forming the Confederation of Cologne. It was an unusual war fought with ships and treaties, rather than knights and banners. The League's fleet, manned by hired sailors and commanded by merchants, besieged Copenhagen. After years of naval battles, they forced King Waldemar IV to sign the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370, granting the League favourable trade rights and control over several Baltic fortresses. It was their greatest victory, and perhaps the beginning of their decline. For the first time, the merchants had acted like a state, wielding collective military power. And though it succeeded, it also changed them. Trade had become politics. Trust had become coercion. The League, born from mutual defence and cooperation, had proven it could fight, but in doing so, it began to resemble the powers it had long avoided becoming. After the war, the merchants returned to their ledgers and warehouses, trying to resume the old order. But things no longer fit quite as neatly. Kings began to see them as rivals. Sailors saw them as employers rather than brothers. The world, ever so slightly, had shifted. In the stillness of a Lübeck counting room, a clerk sharpened his quill and began to copy figures once more: the day's profits from Bruges, the losses from Riga, the shipments delayed in Bergen due to storms. His handwriting was careful, but his thoughts wandered. He wondered if all this precision, this relentless pursuit of balance and fairness, could truly hold against the tides of ambition that were rising beyond the League's reach. He wondered if paper, no matter how well kept, could ever bind the changing world. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Hanseatic League had become a ghost of its former self, still visible on maps and in contracts, but hollowed out by time. The ships still sailed, the ledgers were still written, and the wax seals still pressed onto parchment. But something vital had shifted. The world that once bent around the League's order was moving elsewhere toward new seas, new empires, and new forms of power. For 3 centuries, the League had lived by the belief that stability was strength, that slow and honest trade could hold chaos at bay. And for 3 centuries, it had worked. Its network of merchants and cities had turned the cold waters of the Baltic into one of the most prosperous regions in Europe. Lübeck had grown rich beyond imagining, its warehouses bursting with goods, its guilds meticulous in their records. But now, the world's rhythm was changing, and the League, so adept at maintaining order, could not learn the language of motion. The discovery of the New World in 1492 and the subsequent voyages around Africa and across the Atlantic redrew the geography of wealth. Gold, spices, sugar, and silver began to flow into Europe from oceans the Hanseatic ships had never sailed. Ports like Lisbon, Antwerp, and Seville rose in prominence. The old Baltic routes timber, furs, hemp, and wax suddenly seemed small, provincial, even quaint. The Hanseatic merchants still spoke of grain prices and beer exports, still held meetings in Lübeck's old town hall, still wrote contracts in careful Gothic script. But their influence, once continental, had shrunk to the narrow grey waters they had always known best. Where once they had been innovators, the first to organise collective trade, the first to standardise weights, measures, and letters of credit, they were now traditionalists, bound by their own success. Change frightened them. Within the League itself, divisions deepened. Hamburg, with its access to the North Sea, began to look westward toward the Atlantic trade. Danzig focused on Poland's grain exports. Riga and Reval looked increasingly toward the rising powers of Sweden and Russia. Lübeck, still clinging to its authority, tried to hold the cities together through bureaucracy and meetings, dozens upon dozens of meetings, each more formal and less effective than the last. At the Hansetage, or Hanseatic Diets, city delegates still gathered in the great halls of Lübeck to discuss tariffs, navigation rights, and piracy. But now, the debates dragged on for weeks without resolution. Letters were sent, amendments proposed, and committees formed. The machinery of deliberation continued to hum, even as the world outside moved faster and faster. There were still successes, small but comforting. When pirates returned to the Baltic, the League briefly united to patrol the seas. When England's Henry VIII imposed harsh restrictions on foreign merchants, Lübeck negotiated new privileges. But each victory was temporary, defensive, a stalling tactic against inevitability. In truth, the League was beginning to lose its most precious commodity: trust. Trust had built the Hanseatic world. Trust in ships to arrive, in contracts to be honored, in men to keep their word. But now, with the rise of centralized kingdoms, trust was being replaced by bureaucracy and military might. Monarchs no longer needed merchants to enforce their trade policies. They had fleets and armies for that. In the Baltic, Denmark grew strong under King Christian IV, who saw the League not as a partner, but as a rival. He imposed tolls on their ships, demanded bribes, and built his own navy to control the Öresund Strait. In Sweden, King Gustav Vasa began to expel Hanseatic merchants from Stockholm, arguing that Sweden should control its own trade. Even in England, where the League had once enjoyed near monopoly status in the London steel yard, resentment grew among local merchants. The English saw the Hansetics as foreign interlopers who kept profits flowing back to Germany. By the mid-1500s, the League's influence in London had collapsed entirely. The steel yard was shuttered, its warehouses emptied, its German community scattered. The invisible empire was unraveling, one port at a time. The League's decline was not dramatic. There were no battles marking its end, no grand collapse or fiery revolution. Instead, it faded the way most enduring systems do, quietly, through the erosion of necessity. Ships still bore the Hanseatic seal. Clerks still wrote their reports. Meetings were still called. But fewer cities attended each year. By 1550, fewer than a dozen towns remained active members. The great trading posts, the contours of Bruges, London, Novgorod, and Bergen, were closing one by one. Lübeck itself, once the proud centre of the League, struggled to maintain its own prosperity. Its harbour, once crowded with cogs, grew silent in winter. The warehouses filled with dust. The ledgers continued, but the numbers shrank. In a sense, the League did not die. It simply aged beyond relevance. There is a melancholy beauty in its ending, a long exhale after centuries of careful breath. The merchants who had once ruled the northern seas left behind no monuments, no palaces, no poems. Their legacy was quieter. Standardized accounting, maritime law, postal networks, and the idea that commerce could exist independently of kings. They invented, without realizing it, the first modern economy, a system where trade flowed through cooperation, contracts, and consistency rather than conquest. Their ideas would reappear centuries later in corporations, banks, and trading companies in the East India Companies, in the Lloyds of London, even in the early stock exchanges that now define the modern world. But those descendants would be bolder, faster, and more ruthless. The Hanseatic merchants would not have recognized them. To the men of Lübeck and Danzig, the world was supposed to be measurable, predictable, and fair. They believed the sea could be domesticated through rules and reason. They believed that trust, once earned, would last forever. But history moves differently. In the early 17th century, the League still existed on paper, a shadow of itself, holding occasional meetings, issuing decrees that few obeyed. When the 30 Years' War engulfed Europe, many of its remaining cities were caught between Protestant and Catholic forces. Trade routes collapsed. Armies marched across the same roads that merchants once traveled in peace. Lübeck tried to remain neutral, clinging to its ancient privileges. But neutrality in such a world was just another form of decline. By 1669, the final Hansetag convened in Lübeck. Only 6 cities sent delegates. They met, as always, in the same hall, beneath the same creaking beams, and discussed the same topics: tariffs, tolls, navigation rights, as if nothing had changed. There was no ceremony marking the end. They simply adjourned and never met again. The Hanseatic League, the empire without a crown, had dissolved not in defeat, but in forgetfulness. And yet, in the quiet harbours of northern Europe, traces of it remain. In Lübeck's old salt warehouses, you can still see the merchant marks, carved initials of men who balanced ledgers 6 centuries ago. In Hamburg's trade records, you can trace the meticulous handwriting of Hanseatic clerks. In Bergen, the wooden buildings of brigands still stand, their walls leaning slightly toward the sea, their floors creaking with memory. The Hanseatic cities live on prosperous, independent, and oddly proud of their forgotten empire. Even today, Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen bear the title Free and Hanseatic City, a faint echo of the old order that once united them. Their wealth no longer depends on ships of oak and sails of linen, but the idea that commerce, peaceful, organized, and rooted in trust, can bind the world together, still lingers, like the smell of salt in old wood. If you listen closely, standing on the docks at dusk, you might still hear it, the whisper of ledgers being turned, the rustle of parchment, the creak of ropes in the cold air. The sea remembers what the world forgets. And you might wonder, as the last light fades over the Baltic, whether the age of trust that built the Hanseatic League is truly gone, or whether it simply waits, somewhere beneath the noise of modern trade, for the world to slow down enough to hear it again. If you had lived in England in the 14th century before the Tudors, before the Reformation, before the sea turned England into an empire, you would have seen sheep everywhere. They dotted the hills of Yorkshire and the Cotswolds, grazed the lowlands of Lincolnshire, wandered the meadows of Kent. Their soft bleating filled the mornings, their wool tangled on thorns and fences, and though they rarely appear in chronicles or royal decrees, it was these sheep and the humble, patient work of shearing, spinning, and weaving that quietly built the wealth of medieval England. The English called it the Golden Fleece, not because it glittered, but because it endured. Before coal, before colonies, before machines, wool was the lifeblood of the realm. It clothed peasants and bishops alike, filled the treasuries of abbeys, and paid for castles and cathedrals. When kings went to war, they borrowed against the promise of next year's wool exports. When monks prayed for prosperity, they often did so in churches funded by fleece. It was not glamorous work, and it was rarely noticed. But in every thread of wool lay a history of labour of shepherds, carders, fullers, dyers, and weavers whose combined effort created the first great English economy. The story begins not in the loom house, but in the field. Each spring, when the grass grew thick and green, the sheep were led from their winter pens into open pasture. The shepherd's life was long and lonely. He lived outdoors most of the year, sleeping in a rough hut or under the stars, carrying a horn, a staff, and a dog. He could name every sheep in his flock, not out of affection, but necessity, to keep count, to track illness, to know which animals would yield the best wool. Shearing came in late May or early June, a communal task that turned quiet hills into scenes of noisy activity. Families gathered, knives sharpened, and sheep were clipped one by one. The wool was tied into bundles, sorted by quality, and weighed. A single sheep might yield 5 or 6 pounds of fleece, but the quality varied. The soft, fine wool from the south of England fetched higher prices than the coarse northern kind used for rough cloth. For the peasant, the shearing season was both hope and exhaustion. The sale of wool might pay the year's rent, buy seed for the next harvest, or cover a wedding or a new roof. But it also meant days of aching hands, sore backs, and the smell of lanolin that clung to everything. Once sheared, the wool passed into another world, a chain of invisible hands that turned it into wealth. In the towns, guilds and workshops handled the transformation. The raw fleece was first washed and carded, cleaned of dirt, grease, and burrs, then combed into soft, even strands. This work, mostly done by women, was tedious and time-consuming. The wool had to be soaked in warm water and lye, beaten with sticks, and spread to dry in the sun. Then came the spinning. Before the spinning wheel arrived from the east in the later Middle Ages, spinning was done with a drop spindle, a simple stick, and whorl used to twist fibers into thread. It was slow work, requiring both rhythm and patience. Women spun while walking, talking, tending children, the steady twist of the spindle as familiar as breathing. The result was yarn, the raw material of England's true wealth. Weaving was mostly a male trade, carried out in workshops filled with the constant sound of creaking looms. The loom itself was a large, upright frame of wood with a weighted warp. The weaver sat for hours, passing the shuttle back and forth, tightening the threads and beating the cloth firm. It was monotonous, mechanical, and endless. Yet from these motions came the fabric that clothed kingdoms. A single weaver might produce several yards of cloth in a week, depending on the quality and width. The coarser fabrics were sold locally brown or grey undyed wool for villagers and servants. The finer types were sent to fullers, dyers, and merchants who finished them for export. The colours were limited by nature, but rich in symbolism. A deep blue made from woad signified wealth. Red, from madder root, suggested status and strength. But most cloth remained a simple, practical brown, the colour of the English countryside itself. Once woven, the cloth went through one of the most laborious stages of all, fulling. The weaver's work produced loose, uneven fabric. To tighten and thicken it, the cloth had to be pounded and washed in a mixture of water and unpleasantly urine, which contained ammonia that helped clean and soften the fibres. In earlier centuries, this was done by foot, men or women stamping on the wet fabric in large vats for hours. Later, water-powered mills were built to do the work mechanically. The sound of wooden hammers beating against cloth echoed along rivers throughout England. After fulling, the cloth was dried, brushed with teasel heads to raise the nap, and finally, sheared smooth. The result was a soft, warm material, durable, breathable, and infinitely versatile. The finished product was rolled into bales, marked with the seal of the local guild, and sent to market. But the heart of England's wool trade did not lie in the villages or even the workshops. It lay in a small inland town. Stamford, later Lincoln, then Boston, and eventually Calais, each serving, in its time, as a hub for export. From these centres, merchants bought wool in bulk and shipped it to Flanders, the Low, countries where the finest weavers in Europe turned English fleece into luxury cloth. The connection between England and Flanders was ancient and vital, so much so that kings measured their own fortunes by it. When Edward I levied taxes on wool in the late 1200s, the proceeds funded his wars in Wales and Scotland. When his grandson, Edward III, sought allies against France, he used English wool to secure the loyalty of Flemish merchants. The motto of the time said it plainly: "The wealth of England is in her sheep's back." Indeed, the wool sack, the symbol of England's export wealth, still sits at the centre of the House of Lords, stuffed with fleece, on which the Lord Speaker traditionally sits. It is a relic of a time when the kingdom's power rested not on gold or guns, but on flocks of sheep grazing in the mist. And yet, for all its prosperity, the wool trade created quiet tensions that would shape England for centuries. As demand for wool grew, so too did the hunger for land. Lords discovered that sheep were more profitable than peasants. Fields once filled with crops and villages were converted into pasture. Hedges were raised, cottages torn down, and people pushed out. This slow transformation, the enclosure movement, began as early as the late 1300s, long before it became infamous. It started with small changes. a village shrinking here, a field abandoned there. The shepherds gained work. The farmers lost it. The countryside grew emptier, quieter, more profitable, and lonelier. At the other end of the chain, in the counting houses of London and Antwerp, merchants tallied their profits in tidy ledgers. Their letters show little trace of the toil behind the wool, no mention of the shepherd's cold nights or the fuller's aching legs, only numbers, weights, measures, and prices. But the numbers told their own story. By 1400, English wool accounted for nearly 80% of all European textile exports. It paid for wars, financed cathedrals, and underpinned a growing class of merchants who would soon rival the nobility in wealth and influence. In an age obsessed with lineage and titles, it was the merchant, not the knight, who quietly began to reshape the kingdom's power. As the 14th century drew to a close, the cycle continued. Shearing, spinning, weaving, fulling, shipping, a rhythm older than kings, steady as the seasons. But change was coming in technology, in politics, in the way men measured wealth and worth. For centuries, England had sold its wool abroad, content to let Flemish weavers turn it into riches. But soon, a few bold men would ask a dangerous question. Why send the wool away at all? Why not weave it here, at home? By the dawn of the 15th century, wool was no longer merely England's greatest export, it was its identity. But identities evolve. What began as flocks on a hillside was now an entire economy, a network of shepherds, merchants, dyers, and royal tax collectors, all bound by fleece. Yet the same wool that filled royal treasuries also fueled quiet unrest. You see, the old system, the export of raw wool to Flanders, had made the merchants of Bruges and Ghent rich. English lords grew wealthy, yes, but their profits stopped at the dock. The clothiers of the Low Countries reaped the greater reward. And in a country still recovering from plague, famine, and war, that imbalance began to chafe. The first murmurs of change came not from the great cities, but from small towns with strange, rhythmic names: Colchester, Kendal, Norwich, Leicester, and Whitney. In these places, men began to ask an almost heretical question. What if we made the cloth ourselves? The answer was revolutionary in its quietness. There were no battles, no manifestos, only looms. They were simple things. Rough frames of oak, strung with cords, humming day and night. But inside that dull wooden frame, the fate of England shifted. By keeping the wool at home, clothiers could hire local workers, control quality, and most importantly, capture the profits once lost overseas. At first, this angered the Flemish guilds. They had long depended on English fleece. English kings, however, saw opportunity. Edward III had already tried, decades earlier, to attract Flemish weavers to England by offering them land and privileges. His successors, though distracted by war and debt, allowed the idea to grow. And grow it did. By 1450, towns like Norwich and Bristol were producing fine cloth equal to that of Bruges. The wool that once left the country as raw fleece now returned as finished garments, or never left at all. The English began to weave their own destiny, thread by thread. But this quiet industrial shift did not happen without cost. For the peasant families who once sold their fleece directly to merchants, the rise of local cloth-making changed everything. Wool, once an accessible product of every household, became part of a tightly controlled system. Clothiers bought in bulk, hired spinners and weavers at fixed wages, and often paid not in coin, but in credit, a system that bound poor workers to their employers as surely as the old feudal dues had done. The weaver's life was a strange mix of freedom and bondage. He was no longer a serf. His labour was his own, but he worked endlessly for someone else's gain. In the dim light of a cottage or workshop, he sat before the loom from dawn until dusk. feet pressing treadles, hands guiding the shuttle. The sound of the loom, a steady thunk, swish, thunk, became the heartbeat of entire towns. Outside, the world shifted in rhythm. The streets smelled faintly of dye and wet cloth. Wooden racks stretched across fields, where great sheets of wool dried in the wind. The air was filled with fibre dust, and the chatter of women spinning, gossiping, and singing old ballads to pass the time. These were the new villages of the English cloth trade, neither fully rural nor urban, but something in between. A proto-industry, built on patience. With industry came guilds powerful, self-regulating associations that controlled every stage of production. The Weavers' Guild, the Fullers' Guild, the Dyers' Guild, each with its own charter, laws, and rituals. They decided who could work, what could be made, and how it must be sold. To join a guild was to gain both protection and obligation, the promise of a trade in exchange for loyalty and conformity. The guilds were not romantic brotherhoods, as later painters imagined them. They were bureaucratic and rigid. They fined members for shoddy work, banned innovation that threatened old methods, and enforced long apprenticeships that could last a decade or more. But in their cautious conservatism lay stability, the kind of stability medieval England prized above all else. To the kings and bishops who ruled from above, the guilds were reliable. They paid taxes, supplied armies with cloth, and provided the steady rhythm of employment that kept towns from rebellion, at least for a time. As the 15th century deepened, the wool trade began to intertwine with the grander currents of politics. During the Wars of the Roses, both Yorkists and Lancastrians funded their campaigns with loans from the wool merchants of London and Calais. Each side promised favours, lower taxes, exclusive rights, better access to ports. Merchants, pragmatic as always, lent to both sides. In the dusty ledgers of the Merchant Adventurers, England's leading export company, one finds payments to soldiers, ships, and even spies. The wool trade, so seemingly mundane, quietly lubricated the machinery of civil war. When Henry VII finally emerged victorious in 1485, he inherited not only a throne, but an economy ready for change. He saw in the wool trade the foundation for a stable kingdom. Under his cautious rule, the merchant adventurers were granted new charters. Exporting finished cloth rather than raw wool became royal policy. England was learning to keep its riches at home. Still, for all this growth, the daily life of those within the trade remained monotonous and harsh. A spinner's cottage was often one room, with a low fire and a spindle whirring by the hearth. Women worked from dawn to dusk, their fingers cracked from grease and soap. The air smelled of wool and stale urine from the fulling tubs outside. The rhythm of work was set by daylight and necessity. Children learned the craft almost as soon as they could walk, teasing out fibres, sorting fleece by texture, or winding yarn into skeins. The work was dull, endless, and poorly paid. Yet, it kept families alive, and there was a certain pride in it. The sense that one's labour clothed not just neighbours, but nations. The weaver, by contrast, worked in sound. The loom's clatter filled his ears until even in sleep he could hear it. He was often paid by the yard, not by the hour, and so time itself became a commodity. Each thread was both survival and surrender, a choice between exhaustion and hunger. Meanwhile, in London, cloth merchants built houses of stone. They wore velvet trimmed with fur, the very cloth their weavers could never afford. They invested in ships, financed monasteries, and sat on royal councils. By 1500, the richest merchants in England were not knights or nobles, but men who dealt in cloth. And yet, for all their wealth, their letters reveal a strange anxiety, an awareness that their fortunes depended on forces far beyond their control: weather, war, disease, and the unpredictable whims of kings. A bad harvest could starve sheep, a plague could kill spinners, A war in Flanders could close ports overnight. To be a merchant of wool was to live in a constant balance between risk and routine. In that balance, England itself matured learning to survive not through conquest, but through trade. By the early 16th century, English cloth began to dominate continental markets. The word broadcloth, thick, densely woven, and durable, became synonymous with English quality. Cities like Norwich and Bristol thrived. New ones, like Leeds, began to grow around rivers, where watermills could power fulling hammers. And yet, the land continued to change. Where once whole villages had farmed grain, now great fields were fenced for sheep. The enclosures expanded, displacing more peasants. Rural poverty deepened. Some sought work in the new weaving towns, others turned to begging or theft. Chroniclers of the time noted the contradiction, that the very industry which made England rich also made many of its people poor. Thomas More, writing his Utopia in 1516, put it bitterly, "Your sheep, that were wont to be so meek and tame, now eat up the very men themselves." It was no exaggeration. For every merchant who gained, there were dozens who lost. The golden fleece had begun to tarnish. Still, the rhythm of work went on. Wool was sorted, carded, spun, and woven. Looms clacked through winter nights, fires burned low, and England's wealth and weariness grew together. A traveller passing through a cloth town might have seen little to suggest a revolution. But within those quiet cottages, something extraordinary was happening. The beginning of industrial discipline, the habit of measuring life by work, of finding order in repetition. The wool trade had not only changed England's economy, it was changing its people, teaching them to endure monotony, to value precision, and to trust in the steady promise of labour over the uncertain grace of fate. The world was still medieval, but the rhythm was already modern. And as the looms beat on, a new question began to take shape, one that would echo across the next century. If wool could be England's fortune, what might happen when that fortune ran out? By the mid-16th century, the English wool trade had spun a web that stretched across Europe. From the cold hills of Yorkshire to the counting houses of Antwerp, the quiet labour of shepherds, spinners, and weavers had transformed a small island into a power sustained by cloth. Yet the very success of that industry had begun to reshape the kingdom in ways few could have foreseen. England was becoming something new, a nation of production, disciplined by labour, driven by profit, and slowly unmoored from its feudal past. And at the centre of this transformation, as always, lay the loom. To understand the world of 16th century English cloth, you must imagine the hum of industry spreading outward from every small town. In Norwich, vast sheds were filled with looms, their beams shaking with every turn of the shuttle. In Leeds, fulling mills beat the air with the dull rhythm of hammers. In Colchester, women carried bundles of yarn between houses, their arms red with dye and soap. Each stage of the process remained bound to the next. The shepherd in the field, to the spinner by the fire, the weaver to the merchant, and the merchant to the shipmaster who waited at the port. The chain was unbroken, but fragile, dependent on countless human hands, repeating the same motions with the same precision, year after year. It was, in its own way, a kind of prayer, the patient faith that if the wool was carded clean, if the weave was tight, if the dye took well, then there would be bread on the table and peace in the town. But beneath this rhythm of work ran a current of change. England was no longer content to merely trade. It wanted control. That desire began in Parliament. By the reign of Henry VIII, English kings had realised that whoever controlled cloth controlled wealth, and whoever controlled wealth ruled. Henry's wars, his ships, even his palaces were paid for, in part, by taxes on wool. In 1536, when he dissolved the monasteries, their lands rich in sheep pasture were seized and sold to gentry and merchants who turned them into immense estates devoted to wool production. The countryside began to alter once again. Where monks had once prayed and ploughed, new landlords counted sheep. The landscape grew quieter, emptier, but more profitable.